The morning fog hung over London like a shroud, grey and heavy, and Winston Churchill sat beneath it without ever stepping outdoors. Inside the cabinet war rooms that dimly lit Warren beneath the city that had become the nerve center of the British Empire, he sat hunched forward as if time itself pressed on his shoulders. His robe was still wrapped around him, the smell of cigar smoke woven into the fibers like memory itself. The day had barely begun when the first telegrams arrived. He could hear distant footsteps rushing down the concrete corridor long before the door opened. He already knew something was wrong. You could feel disaster before you read it on paper. The world trembled first, like glass on a table before a bomb hits. Colonel Stewart opened the door without knocking. That alone was enough to tighten the Prime Minister's jaw. Under normal conditions, such a breach of decorum would be outrageous, but this was not a normal dawn. Churchill looked up with those small, calculating eyes that had peered down the throat of war for decades. Well, he growled through the haze of his cigar, what catastrophe has woken the Empire this hour? Stewart swallowed. His lips trembled, not with fear of Churchill, but with the magnitude of what he carried. Prime Minister Japan has attacked across Asia. Not just one target, multiple, nearly everywhere at once. For a moment the smoke seemed to freeze in the air. Churchill's eyebrows rose as if someone had shot a bullet past his ear. He pressed his palm on the desk as though steadying himself against an invisible blow. Across Asia, he repeated, quietly at first, as though tasting each word. Not merely Malaya or Hong Kong. No, sir. Stewart extended the message. They've struck Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Thailand, Guam, Wake Island, and Sir Pearl Harbor. The Americans are burning. Churchill did not breathe for a long moment. Outside, a typewriter clattered somewhere like distant gunfire. Inside, the war that had consumed Europe suddenly felt small. The map that covered the wall behind him, oceans sprawling like the veins of the world, seemed alive. He stood slowly, his face stiff, unreadable. Then he walked to the map, cigar glowing like a coal between his fingers. He traced the Pacific with his thumb, from Singapore down toward the Dutch East Indies, across the India Ocean toward Madagascar. So, he murmured, the Japanese Empire leaps like a tiger at the world's throat. His voice hardened. At last, he said, America is truly in the war. And though the weight of what was unfolding could crush nations, Churchill's eyes, cold, sharp, ancient as iron, flickered with something fierce. Hope, he turned back to Stewart. Wake the cabinet, all of them, and get the chief of staff in here. We must respond before Tokyo finishes breakfast. The war rooms crowded fast, uniforms, papers, the rustling of maps like wings. Ministers, who had been asleep moments earlier, now stood in half-buttoned coats, hair flattened from pillows, but their faces were hard with urgency. The air smelled of sweat, damp wool, and a future none could see clearly. Churchill stood at the center of it all, not as an old man weary of war, but as a pillar holding up the breaking sky. The reports came hour by hour, building like a storm surge with no retreating tide. Admiral Pound entered first with the grim look of a man who had seen entire fleets sink in his mind. Japanese bombers hit Singapore's northern airfields just after dawn. He reported, our fighters were caught on the ground, losses are significant, and the Prince of Wales. Churchill asked sharply, the repulse. Pound hesitated, 1 second too long. They are underway but outnumbered. Naval Command fears torpedo attack will follow. Churchill gripped the edge of the table. the Prince of Wales, and repulse the pride of the Royal Navy in the Pacific, newly arrived, barely blooded. They were all Britain had standing between Japan and the rich oil fields of Borneo. If they fell, the empire's lifeblood would drain into the sea. Around him ministers shifted uneasily, maps crackling under restless fingers. Churchill stared into the papers like a man trying to see the future through smoke. "Japan has chosen fire," he said finally, "then we shall answer with steel." But inside, beneath the granite words, lay something far darker, dread twisting like wire. Britain was stretched thin across continents. Singapore was far away, supplies limited, seas hostile. The Japanese military, lightning, swift and ruthless, had prepared for this moment for years, and now everything burst at once like artillery across a horizon too wide to defend. A messenger rushed in with another sheet, another blow. "Thailand has capitulated within hours." He read, voice cracking, "Japanese forces crossing by land into Malaya. British defensive lines are falling back." Churchill exhaled slowly, a cloud of smoke swirling upward. "Asia is afire," he said. Foreign Secretary Eden leaned forward. "Prime Minister, we need a directive, troop allocations, reinforcements." "Yes." Churchill snapped, "And we shall send them. Whatever we have left, whatever can still sail, will head for Singapore at once." He paused. "But we must accept this truth," he continued, voice dropping like a verdict. "The Japanese have begun a war the likes of which this empire has not faced in centuries. It is global. It is total. And we must wage it without faltering from the jungles of Burma to the reefs of the Pacific. If we do not, Asia will be lost for 100 years. No one responded. They didn't need to. They understood. The empire now bled in two hemispheres. Later that night, Churchill finally stepped above ground. Outside, London was blacked out, but the air tasted of coal and cold wind. Big Ben loomed like a giant in the darkness, a silhouette more than a structure. Somewhere a siren moaned, a reminder that though Germany's bombs had lessened, fear still lived in the cracks of every brick. He lit another cigar and walked slowly, body aching with the strain of leadership. He thought of Hong Kong, a city glittering like a gem, now smothered under smoke and artillery. He thought of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, whose mighty guns pointed out to sea while invasion crept through the jungles behind them. He imagined young soldiers, untested, clutching rifles, while Japanese troops swarmed through rubber plantations like shadows with bayonets. He had known war, but this felt like watching the world fracture along every line at once. A voice behind him said softly, "You look tired, Winston." He turned. Clementine, his wife, his anchor in the storm, stood wrapped in a heavy coat. Her presence softened the night. He managed a faint smile, weary but real. "Tired, yes," he replied, but also awakened. She stepped closer, eyes searching his. "Because America is with us now." He nodded. "Yes, at last. The arsenal of democracy is unleashed." His voice trembled not with fear, but relief so deep it bordered joy. He had spent 2 years urging Roosevelt toward full commitment. Now Japan had forced their hand, and though the cost was blood and ashes, the alliance was sealed. With America and the empire together, Churchill whispered, "There is no force on earth that can hold us back forever." Clementine touched his arm. "But before victory there will be sacrifice." He swallowed. The truth hung between them like frost. "Yes," he said, "God help every man under the Union Jack in Asia tonight. They stand at the edge of the abyss, and the enemy will show no mercy." He looked up at the blank sky as though seeing battlefields far across the world. But they will not stand alone. The next morning brought worse news. Hong Kong was collapsing. Japanese boats swarmed its shores like locusts. British and Canadian troops were overwhelmed, ammunition dwindling, hospitals overflowing. The radio carried fragments of desperate transmissions, static drowning out screams, commands, pleas for support that could not come. Churchill sat listening in silence, knuckles white. Hold as long as you can. A distant officer crackled through the speakers. If we must die, we die fighting. The line went dead. Not a man in the war room spoke. Then another report, this one like a hammer blow. The Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk. Churchill's heart clenched. 2 great warships, lost in a single day, the first and only capital ships ever sunk solely by aircraft while at sea. The room reeled. He stared at the telegram, jaw locked, breath like stone in his chest. Then he said softly, to no one in particular, "This is a day to weep." But he did not weep. He stood, straightened his coat, gathered himself like a general preparing to lead through hell. "Send word to the Admiralty," he commanded, voice steady again. "We shall rebuild. We shall return to those waters with carriers and fighters enough to blacken the sky. Japan has opened a door, but we shall be the ones to close it." His eyes smoldered. With thunder, days became weeks. The world changed with every sunrise. Japan swept south with terrifying precision. The fall of Kuala Lumpur sent shockwaves through Britain. The troops dug in again and again, overwhelmed each time. The monsoon rains turned the ground to mud, the air to fever. Malaria claimed nearly as many soldiers as bullets. Every night Churchill lay awake staring at the ceiling of his underground bedroom. The weight of the empire pressing down like earth, above a coffin. Maps flooded his mind, arrows driving towards Singapore, British lines shrinking like water drying in heat. He felt every failure like a personal wound, but he did not yield. Each morning he rose, lit a cigar, and entered the war room like a king stepping into the arena with lions. He rallied the cabinet with speeches that shook walls. He cabled Roosevelt with urgency and flame. He stood before Parliament and thundered, "We shall fight them in the East as we have fought them in the West, with courage unbroken and resolve unshaken." But inside, in moments of rare solitude, he whispered prayers he would never admit aloud. One night, a young radio operator, barely 20, entered Churchill's office with trembling hands. "Message from Singapore, sir." Churchill read it slowly. Each sentence was a blade, enemy within miles. Troops exhausted, ammunition failing, civilian panic widespread, requesting evacuation orders. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were ancient, no evacuation. He said quietly, "They are to hold. Reinforcements sail, though they may arrive too late. But we do not abandon our fortress. Singapore must stand as long as men still breathe to defend it." The operator hesitated. "Sir, my brother is there." Churchill looked at him, a long, deep look, full of sorrow and steel. "Then he fights for the world tonight," Churchill replied. "And the world will remember him." The young man nodded, eyes shining with tears he refused to shed. He turned and left with shoulders squared, as if Churchill's resolve had poured into him like fire. When the door closed, Churchill exhaled shakily, alone again with burden. He whispered into the quiet, "Hold Singapore, just hold." But the wheels of war showed mercy to no one. January bled into February. The Japanese tightened their grip like a vise. They controlled the skies, the seas, the very rivers. British troops retreated into the city like sand, swept by tide. Churchill read the reports with clenched teeth, cigar burning down to nothing. His advisers urged him to consider surrender not out of cowardice, but humanity, to spare the defenders from annihilation, to spare civilians from slaughter. But Churchill still hoped for a miracle, reinforcements arriving in time, American carrier strikes, a sudden shift of fortune. He prayed for it, yet miracles did not come. The surrender of Singapore arrived like a death sentence. 80 zeros, 0, British, Indian, and Australian troops marched into captivity, the largest capitulation in British military history. When Churchill read the final message, he sat motionless for a long time. No one spoke. Even the lights seemed dimmer, as if London itself mourned. Then he whispered, voice cracking, "This is the worst disaster and greatest capitulation in the history of British arms. No triumph, no defiance, only truth, cold as the grave." But then he looked up, eyes burning like a man who refused to drown. "But it is not the end," he continued louder now. "No matter how far we fall, we shall rise. The sun will rise again on the empire, not as it was, but as it must become tested in fire, strengthened in resolve. Japan has struck with fury, but they have also awakened a giant alliance, Britain, America, free China, the Commonwealth." He slammed his fist on the table. "We will bring war back to their shores, inch by inch, island by island, ocean by ocean. And when victory comes, it will be total." Churchill aged a decade that winter, though only months passed. His hair grayed more, his waistline shrank from stress and sleepless nights. But his spirit, that indomitable force, grew sharper, harder, fiercer. He wrote speeches that electrified nations. He met Roosevelt across the Atlantic to forge strategy for the Pacific, two giants shaping the fate of the world. In the warmth of the White House fireside, Churchill stared across the map with Roosevelt and said, "Let us teach the Japanese that though they can strike like lightning, we shall strike like thunder, slow to gather, but unstoppable once rolling." Roosevelt nodded aside, glancing with a half-smile. "Winston, when Americans are angry, they build ships like children build sandcastles, and they're angry. Together they planned the island campaigns, the leapfrogging assault across the Pacific, carrier warfare, amphibious landings, submarine strangulations. It would take years, millions of tons of steel, rivers of blood, but they would win." Churchill returned to Britain with renewed fire. In Parliament he declared, "We have seen the world set ablaze from Hong Kong to Hawaii. But I say to you, the flame that consumes today shall forge tomorrow. We shall prevail in the East as we prevail in the West, for the sword of freedom is drawn, and it shall not be sheathed until the tyrant falls." The chamber roared. History moved, and though victory lay distant, Churchill never forgot the morning it all began. The day Japan struck across all of Asia and shattered the illusion that war had boundaries. He remembered his first words spoken with shock, with dread, but also with fate behind them. "At last, America is truly in the war." Those words changed everything. For Britain, for the world, for the centuries yet to come. Churchill carried them like a banner through every defeat and every triumph. Through the burning of Asia, the slow grinding return of Allied power, and finally to the moment when Japan surrendered. And the war ended not in Europe alone, but everywhere. Years later, in quiet reflection, Churchill would write, "I knew that day we would suffer greatly, but I also knew that once the United States was engaged, liberty would not die. That morning was the storm that brought the sunrise." History remembers battles, but wars are won by resolve. And on that dawn, beneath smoke and telegrams and disaster, Winston Churchill found the resolve that would guide an empire through its darkest hour, and the world was never the same again.